Yes, nimeanza. Iko. Oh, it's small. Alright, guys, again over there, welcome back to Code Archive channel, and this is the third video on the Spring Boot Web MVC, and today we'll take a look at developing a simple Spring Boot application, which we will then run and test it. So without wasting time, let me turn to my slide so that we can review what we covered last on Spring Boot Web MVC before we look into the video of today, and then we can continue from there. So I believe you can see my screen over there, and let me turn to presentation so that we can have a look at what we already covered. So in the last video, lesson 1, we had looked at Spring Boot Web MVC's introduction, and we introduced the concept of a Spring Boot framework. And if you have not attended that lesson, you can go always and go to the playlist on Spring Boot Web MVC and look at the introduction to Spring Boot. So in that section, we had covered the basic introduction to Spring Boot, what is it, and what are the basic applications. We also looked at the module of Spring. We said that Spring Boot is one of the Spring Framework module, and we looked at the versions of Spring Boot from the time it was developed to the current most modern version, and then we looked at the advantages of Spring Boot framework, and these were some of the advantages which we had looked at them. And then we also take a look at the differences between the Spring and the Spring Boot framework, and we said that these are the key main differences between the Spring and the Spring Boot frameworks. And in the introduction part of Spring Boot also, we looked at the goals of Spring Boot. Why was it? What was the main goal of designing this framework? And the main goals of designing this Spring Boot framework was to avoid XML configurations and also to avoid a lot of import statements, and also to avoid lots of annotation configurations on classes. So these were the three goals we looked at in the previous video, and then we also looked at the features of Spring Boot framework, and we said that some of the very important features of Spring Boot framework are these illustrated as follows, and we explained them in the last video. We also looked at other modules of Spring, and we said apart from Spring Boot, Spring also has some other modules such as the Spring Data module, which we use it to access our databases. We also have the Spring Security, which we use it to secure our backend applications. Spring Batch and Spring Web, these are just a few of the Spring Boot Spring modules. So we have other modules which we shall see as we continue developing more complex backend applications. And then we looked at lesson 2, which was the Spring Boot Web MVC architecture, and we saw the overall architecture diagram of the designing Spring Boot application, and we said that this diagram is as follows. We have 4 main layers of this architecture, and the first layer from the client is the controller layer, where we define our REST APIs. Then we have the service layer, where we define our logic for our application. We have the module layer, where we define the entities for our application, and those entities are going to be stored into database in form of tables. And then we also have another layer which we call the repository layer, which defines some CRUD operations or CRUD methods which we can use to manipulate the entities in our database. CRUD means is a short form for create, read, update, and delete. For example, we have our application which is going to store users. So first of all, our application should be able to create user. Our application should be able to fetch all the users and read all the users. Our application should be able to update a user in the database. Our application should be able to delete user. So these are the 4 main CRUD operations that we normally perform on any entity that we store in our database. So in the next lesson, which is lesson 3, we will now take a look at a sample application that we're going to build, and then we will perform all the CRUD operations on that entities. So we are going to create all these layers. We are going to create the controller layer. We are going to create the service layer. We are going to create the model layer, and we're going to have our database, which is MySQL, that we'll be using. We're going to create the repository layer, and then our client, we will be using a different client to access this application that we have built. Alright, so otherwise stay tuned and let us look at the next lesson. And today I want us to look at lesson 3, and then in the next video we will start creating the application. So in lesson 3, I want us to work through the environmental setup and see the prerequisite that is required for creating our application. So here we will need some basic environmental setup. The first thing that the first prerequisite that you need to understand before creating a Spring Boot application is that you need to have some basic knowledge of Java fundamentals, and that's why we first of all we started doing a playlist on Java fundamentals so that we can have the basic concept of Java. So we need to have the basic understanding of Java programming language, which I believe we already have. If you don't have that knowledge, you can go back to our playlist and view the Java fundamentals from lesson 1 to lesson 20. So we have this is also the channel, this is the link to the playlist. And then apart from Java, we also need to have a Spring, we need to use a Spring framework. We need to have a basic understanding of Spring framework, which we are going to introduce. And then you will need to install Java Development Kit version 11, 17 or 18, and this is the link which you can use to install the JDK, which I believe most of us have already installed. And then you also need to have a knowledge and basic understanding of either Maven or Cradle Dependency Management System.